Welcome, everybody. My name's Graham Walker, president of Patrick Henry College. I'm delighted to welcome everybody here to the kickoff event of our Newsmaker interview series this week with Marvin Olasky. Patrick Henry College is very privileged to have on our faculty Dr. Marvin Olasky, who serves as our distinguished professor of journalism and public policy. You may know that he spent many years on the faculty of the University of Texas, is the author of numerous books, served as the provost of the King's College, and also, and just as importantly, has been editor-in-chief of World Magazine for these many years. Decades, there you go, right. Founding inspiration and still guiding force at World Magazine. It's a pleasure to have Dr. Olasky on our faculty. And of course, also, it's wonderful for our students who learn from him, work with him, and get some inside track on what it was like to write some pivotal books in the development of American public policy, such as The Tragedy of American Compassion, and the title Compassionate Conservatism, which was taken up by a Republican presidential candidate a few cycles back. Thank you for all you've done to inform public policy debate in America, and thank you for bringing today's speaker to Patrick Henry College, who is Reggie Littlejohn. Reggie Littlejohn is the founder and president of Women's Rights Without Frontiers, an international coalition to expose and oppose forced abortion, gendercide, and sexual slavery in China. Women's Rights Without Frontiers seeks to form a left-right human rights and humanitarian coalition to end forced abortion and gendercide. As a graduate of Yale Law School and an acclaimed international expert on China's one-child policy, Reggie has testified before the United Nations, before the U.S. Congress, and at the British, Irish, and Canadian parliaments. Her first address at the European Parliament redefined the debate about China's one-child policy, revealing it to be systematic state-sponsored violence against women. Her address was included as a chapter in the book, Human Rights in China After the Olympic Games. Women's Rights Without Frontiers has the only Chinese website in the world dedicated to exposing the brutal truth about forced abortion in China. Reggie has also led international efforts to free blind human rights activist Cheng Wang-Chen, who arrived in the United States in 2012. So please give her and Dr. Marvin Olasky a warm welcome.
Well, Reggie, thank you for coming. And on this wintry day, we now have a fire here of sorts, and that's all very appreciated. I understand that you grew up in a Christian home, but you somewhat startled your parents when you were 16, or at some point refused to go to church anymore. Could you tell us about that a little?
Well, yes, I did grow up in a Christian home, and at age 16 I decided that there was no God, and so I wrote my parents a letter and sat them down and told them and had them read the letter aloud and told them that I was no longer going to church. So.
And how did they take that?
I'm sure that they went to prayer over it, but they allowed me to not go to church, so I did not go to church for the rest of my time of high school and through college and for many years afterwards.
And then in college, I understand that an ancient literature course actually had some effect on you.
Well, yeah, I had to take an ancient literature course for my major, and we had to read, I believe it was the Gospel of John, and I had never read a book of the Bible start to finish before, and when I read that gospel, I just saw that who Jesus was, and I just said, this is not what I was rejecting. And so that moved me from being an atheist to being an agnostic.
Okay. Because you appreciated it but still did not believe it?
Right.
Okay. And then I understand that you had a college sweetheart and got married pretty quickly?
Yeah, and actually he had something to do with my my conversion in the sense of believing in God, because falling in love with him and just looking into his eyes, I just could not believe that he had simply evolved from blue-green algae. It was just not possible.
So maybe you did, but he didn't?
Yeah, that's right. I knew he didn't. Maybe I did, but he didn't. So that meant that there had to be something else out there.
And how old were you when you actually got married?
27.
Okay.
And now don't ask me how long we've been married.
Okay, I'm not going to. No. But then you were enrolled at Yale Law School, and he was at Yale Divinity School?
Yes,
okay.
That's right.
So how did that work with a lawyer and a lawyer to be with a minister to be? Aren't these two different worlds?
Yes, the legal world and the world of the pastor are at extreme odds with each other. So.
And did he help you think religiously about the law, and you helped him think legally about religion?
Well, no, actually what happened is I ended up going to seminary and actually pastored my own church for a couple years.
Okay.
But then we were like sinking into a financial black hole, and since I was the one with the law degree, I was the one who was elected to get us out of it. So I then went back to becoming a lawyer and worked as a litigator for approximately 8 years in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Okay. And did you enjoy that?
Well, increasingly I enjoyed it. You know, in the beginning, when you first start out as a junior litigator, your life is hell. It's utter hell. And that's just the way it is for the first couple of years for most people in major law firms as litigators. But then towards the end of my time there, I began working with some extremely delightful people and actually began really enjoying my work. And the other thing about it is I believe that this is part of God's plan, because it was as an attorney in these law firms that I started my work concerning the one-child policy. So on a pro bono basis, I represented a couple of refugees from China who were victims of the one-child policy. And at the time, in the mid-'90s, I knew that China had a one-child policy, but I did not know that the one-child policy is currently enforced through forced abortion, forced sterilization, and infanticide. And I just remember sitting behind my desk in my beautiful law firm, surrounded by freedom and civilization, and thinking to myself, I can't believe that right at this moment, women on the other side of the world, and we're talking about a fifth of the population of the world, okay? Women are being dragged out of their homes, strapped down to tables, and forced to abort babies that they want up to the 9th month of pregnancy. I was utterly appalled.
And you had some sleepless nights about that?
Oh, I had many sleepless nights about that. It was haunting. It haunted me that this was happening.
So that part of your work haunted you, the pro bono work. Did the other part of it haunt you?
Well, I would not say that my litigation cases haunted me, because I was working very hard, typical of any associate. I was pulling all-nighters. I had a sleeping bag in my office. I pulled at least one all-nighter on average a week. And at one point, I did not leave my office for 10 days, just working flat out. So it wasn't a matter of being haunted. It was a matter of being, I guess, driven.
Okay. So driven there,
and yeah.
Driven and haunted. And also, you had some personal experiences of loss.
Yes. During my time as an attorney, I had 2 miscarriages, and that was very difficult. So what that did, I think, well, in my first miscarriage, I had never dreamed I would have a miscarriage. To my knowledge, no one in my family had ever had a miscarriage. And so just in the first trimester, I started to bleed. My husband rushed me to the hospital at Stanford. We were living near there at the time. And I just laid on the couch and basically, at the end of the day, after a bunch of tests, they said, "You're having a miscarriage. We can't stop it." That was a Wednesday. Anyway, so I was just heartbroken, and I called my mother, and I just said to her, why would God allow me to become pregnant with a baby that is very much wanted, who would be loved and cared for wonderfully in this world, and then take that baby away? And my mother said, we will never know the answer to that question, but God does everything for a purpose. And I believe that if you offer your suffering up to him, that he will use this in a way that you can't imagine in the future.
And then it happened again.
And then I had a second miscarriage, that's right. But I believe that those miscarriages and the pain of losing those babies was what opened me up to the pain of the women in China who are losing babies under forced abortion. I mean, of course, having a miscarriage does not carry with it the violence of having somebody break into your home and drag you out and force you to abort a baby. These abortions and sterilizations are mostly done without anesthesia. okay? So it's an extreme act of violence. So, a miscarriage doesn't carry that with it, but at least I knew what it was like to lose a baby. And so when I heard about these forced abortions, my heart went out to these women in a way that it might not have if I had not had the experience of miscarrying my own babies.
So that's haunting you, but yet you're being very productive and financially useful with your most of your time, and then something happened that yanked you out of that 8-year period of corporate law along with pro bono stuff. You probably would have kept doing that, except, well, tell us what happened.
Right. What happened is I had to have, I got really sick, and I had to leave the law on a medical leave of absence. And I had to have bilateral mastectomies with implant reconstruction because of breast lumps that had developed, that they couldn't tell what they were, and because of my family's strong history of breast cancer. My mom had bilateral mastectomies. My younger sister has had bilateral mastectomies. And under normal circumstances, mastectomies with implant reconstruction is 2 months off of work. But because I got this hospital superbug, the MRSA staph infection, which they couldn't stop. I mean, they tried several different ways of stopping it, and they had to, and they ended up putting me in the hospital. I had this PICC line, peripheral intercardial catheter, where they were just pumping massive amounts of antibiotic directly into my heart because it would burn out your veins if you tried to do that much antibiotics in your veins. And I was on that for almost 10 weeks, and my hair was coming out in handfulls, my kidneys, my liver, my immune system were all impacted, and I had to have a number of more surgeries because of the infection and the reconstruction. It completely impacted the reconstruction, and I was disabled for 5 years. So I went overnight from being a high-powered litigation lawyer in a large law firm to lying on my back and begging God to spare my life. And it was during that time that I feel like the Lord turned me from a life of focusing on making lots of money as an attorney to saving lives in China.
So once you're healthy again, tell us what happens.
Well, a couple things. First of all, during my illness, when I started to feel better, I got this idea that wouldn't go away. So I think it was from God. I said to him, Lord, you made me to be a woman of action. When I get better, what do you want me to do? I'm a lawyer. You want me to go back and be some kind of an international human rights litigator? I'm a pastor. Do you want me to preach? And he said, no, I want you to write a screenplay. And I said, Lord, you've equipped me to do a lot of things in this life, and one of them is not to write a screenplay. And I felt that he said, my grace is sufficient for you, and my strength is made perfect in your weakness. So he chose something that was completely, I had no education, I had no background, and so it was really a partnership, almost like a pregnancy, where you're working really closely with God. I mean, I was praying and fasting between every scene, and I wrote this screenplay called Pearls of China about women. It's about a young couple that gets pregnant without a birth permit and their attempt to escape the forced abortion required under the one-child policy. And the screenplay won a number of awards, including first place in the adventure and action category. And so I'm one of the things I'm doing is in the process of producing it to be a feature-length film. I think that the film is going to be very, very powerful in ending the one-child policy because nothing captures hearts and minds like a drama.
And what's the status of that right now?
Well, we've taken it basically through development, and now it's ready for production. So we are in the process of raising production funding, and we've got budget, business plan, casting, locations, all of that. So that's where that is. And so I really thought of myself as being a filmmaker, which was enough of a change in mindset from being an attorney to being a filmmaker. Sure. And then during that time, there was an organization that only it's in Brussels, and it focuses on putting on conferences on Chinese human rights and North Korean human rights at the European Parliament. And during my illness, when I had been researching all this stuff about the one-child policy, because I was praying for the women who were being forcibly aborted, I got on their email list. So I got an email blast, I was one of, I don't know how many thousands of people got this, saying, this is in 2008, we are putting on a conference in the European Parliament in connection with the Beijing Olympics in 2008. And I did something that I have never done before since I wrote the president. I said, great list of issues, great list of experts. How come no one is speaking about the one-child policy? And the president actually wrote me back, and he wrote me this email that said, don't you realize that the coercive enforcement of the one-child policy is a thing of the past? It's all voluntary now. And I said, oh, is that so? And so I started hitting him with document after document after document after document, showing, to the extent that where he finally said, all right, I surrender. I see now that forced abortion is happening right now in China. Would you be our expert? Would you come to the European Parliament at our expense and give and be the first person ever to address the European Parliament on the issue of the one-child policy? And I just remember sitting there, because I was not well yet. I mean, I was not completely back yet. I was almost back. But I was sitting there in my little red pajamas. I almost fell over my chair because I did not remotely consider myself to be an expert on this, okay? I don't have a degree in East Asian Studies. I don't speak Mandarin. But, I said, okay, wow, what an open door. So I said yes, and I went to the European Parliament, and I delivered a speech called The Consequences of Coercion, Forced Abortion, China's War Against Women, which that war against women phrase has been co-opted since then. But that particular address changed the entire focus of the debate, because before that address, everybody had been talking about the one-child policy as a life issue, which for the pro-life movement, of course, it's a life issue. In the United States, we've had about 55 million abortions since the Roe v. Wade decision. In China, the Chinese Communist Party boasts that they have prevented 400 million lives through the one-child policy. That's greater than the whole population of the United States and Canada combined. But the life movement was not paying attention to that because they were too involved with parochial things. And then the pro-choice, to deal with China, and the pro-choice movement wasn't dealing with it either because it had to do with abortion, and even if it was forced abortion, they were very skittish about taking a stand against any abortion, so no one was paying attention to it at all. And so what I did is I shifted the focus from the babies to the women. And I said, look at this. This is something that pro-choice and pro-life can agree on. No one supports forced abortion because it's not a choice. And that's when the issue took off and got traction.
And you set up a new organization.
And I reluctantly set up a new organization because after I came back from the European Parliament, and people there told me that no one had chosen this as their own, as their sole issue. That everybody sort of knew what was going on, and it was sort of one of many things on their plate, but nobody had chosen to focus on that issue. And I said, my goodness, we're talking about a fifth the population of the world here. And this is, because of the numbers involved, this is the biggest women's rights, and in fact, it is the biggest human rights issue in the world today, and no one is focusing on it. So
a lot of people doing it peripherally. Steve Mosher, a long time ago, got that ball rolling, investigating and so forth. But no one had actually been specializing.
Steve Mosher is the person who, with great courage, brought the issue out of China originally in the 80s. And so anyone who deals with the one-child policy is basically standing on his shoulders. And I don't know why these people thought that no one had focused their issue themselves exclusively on it, but the Mosher Population Research Institute really has more of a worldwide focus.
Okay.
So whereas Women's Rights Without Frontiers has a laser focus, we are just on the one-child policy.
And that name purposefully chosen so that it can appeal to people both on the left and on the right, I take it?
Yes. This is a women's rights issue.
Do you want to show that,
yes,
that 3-minute or so video right now?
Yes. So this is called Stop Forced Abortion, China's War Against Women. I'm a litigation attorney, and in the 90s, I represented a client who had escaped China. I represented her in her case for political asylum in the United States, and she had been forcibly sterilized. That was my introduction to the reality behind the one-child policy. In fact, China's one-child policy causes more violence against women and girls than any other official policy on earth. I call it China's war on women and girls. When I say forced abortion, I mean women are literally dragged out of their homes or off the streets. They can be jailed in family planning jail cells, forced to abort children that they want. And this can happen all the way up to the 9th month of pregnancy. Some of these forced abortions are so violent that the women themselves die along with their full-term babies. One case that I'll never forget is of a young woman who was 7 months pregnant without a birth permit. So that would be an illegal pregnancy, who was walking down the street, and she was grabbed by family planning cadres, dragged off the street, strapped down to a table, forced to abort the baby that she very desperately wanted. And in the end, one of the medical personnel came to her with the body of her aborted baby and said, "You need to pay for this so that we can dispose of the body." And she said she didn't have any money, so they just laid that body right next to her in the bed. And I've got a photograph of her looking down and just grieving the loss of this 7-month-old baby that was forcibly aborted. It does not matter whether you are pro-choice or pro-life on this issue. No one supports forced abortion because it's not a choice. And this violence must stop. My goal in establishing women's rights without frontiers is to end forced abortion and sexual slavery in China. And to that end, I have testified before Congress, I've addressed the European Parliament, briefed the White House. When I started this several years ago, no one was talking about the one-child policy. And now, because of the documentation that has been generated, two things have happened. Number one, the Chinese Communist Party cannot deny that the one-child policy is enforced through forced abortion, forced sterilization, and infanticide. And number two, it seems that almost everybody is talking about it at this point. It's become a household issue. Stop the violence. End China's war on women. Forced abortion is not a choice.
So now, in the news a couple of months ago, there were declarations that the one-child policy was over. Tell us about the reality of that.
This is an ongoing, intense frustration for me, because the Chinese Communist Party will tweak the policy, and even in their own press, they're not touting it as any kind of a major change. But the Western press consistently misrepresents it. by running headlines like China eases the one-child policy or China abandons the one-child policy. Okay, so this is what happened a couple months ago. China is heading for a demographic disaster, and that disaster is threefold. Number one, because of the traditional preference for boys, girls are being selectively aborted, so that there are currently 37 million more males than females living in China today, and that is internally, domestically destabilizing, and is also raises the possibility of international destabilization. Okay, then number two, China has instituted the one-child policy because under the Mao era, Chairman Mao had said, people are the strength of China, and the average fertility rate of women in the Mao era was 5.9, almost 6 kids per woman. So they had this big population explosion, and then in the Deng era, they said, oh my gosh, we can't sustain this population. We have to limit the population, and so we're going to institute this draconian one-child policy. And now their population, the rate is about 1.5, depending who you ask, children per woman, which is substantially below 2.1 replacement level. Meanwhile, this big population explosion that happened under the Mao era is heading towards retirement, and they don't have the young population to sustain it, and they don't have Social Security as we know it. Okay, so I'm worried that we're going to see some very troubling end-of-life issues, just like we're seeing troubling beginning-of-life issues now. Then thirdly, China is actually losing business to other nations because they don't have that young workforce that they used to have, and there are other countries that are actually less expensive for manufacturers, and they are losing business because of a lack of numbers of their workforce. Okay, so they've got these intractable demographic problems. So what they're doing is they are inching towards slightly modifying the one-child policy. Most recently, they said if one member of a couple is themselves an only child, they can have a second child. Mm-hmm. All right? Okay. Now, that was reported as China eases, China abandons the one-child policy. That is not true. First of all, that exception is very narrow, and according to their own demographers, will only affect about 5 million couples. Mm-hmm. All right? Secondly, the core of the policy is not whether the government allows a woman to have one child or 2 children. The core of the policy is the government dictating to people how many children they can have and then enforcing that limit coercively through forced abortion, so that even under this exception, those couples who can have 2 children, they will need to have a birth permit for their first child and their second child. And if they don't have one, they are still at risk of forced abortion. It's the coercion that is at the core of the policy, and that has not changed.
So without a birth permit, you are not allowed to have a child.
That's right.
Yeah, and that hasn't changed at all.
No.
So let me ask another thing. Okay, you're talking about forced abortion, and then certainly an issue that's very hot now is sexual slavery, and how do these two go together, and if so, how?
Well, you have a situation where you have 37 million more men than women, so there's a couple things that are happening. Because there are fewer women, they are upwardly mobile in a way, so that the poorest villages in the most outlying areas, they have a phenomenon known as bachelor villages, where all the marriage-age women have gone to the local town or to the city. And so these villages are just men that will never find wives, and they call them bare branches. Because
bare branches?
Bare branches, because from the entire history of China down to that person, that family line is ending with that man, because he will never marry, he will never have a wife. So for people who are more men of means, there's sexual slavery, and so women are trafficked within China and from the surrounding countries as well, and it's driven by this 37 million more men than women. And for example, there are women who are trafficked in, or who they're not trafficked in, but they get caught up in sexual slavery from North Korea. If human rights is worse anywhere in the world than in China, it's North Korea. And these poor girls will make it over the border thinking that they have made it into some kind of safety, and they get immediately snapped up into the sex slave trade, and there's nothing they can do about it, because if they say, I'm being raped, I'm being tortured, they can't go to the authorities, because the authorities will say, oh, you are from North Korea, you are an illegal economic migrant, and they will repatriate them against international refugee law, and then these women can end up in concentration camps, and they could even be executed because escaping from North Korea is considered to be treason. So these North Korean women are some of the saddest people in the world.
Yeah, last fall we interviewed here Melanie Kirkpatrick, who wrote an exceptionally good book about Korea called Escape from North Korea, which she detailed that. Mm-hmm. So there's that aspect of it in terms of you're a criminal there. There's also a lot of racism apparently, and ethnic pride and denigration of other ethnicities in China. So it's really a miserable situation, and you're trying to deal then with abortion and sex slavery and that whole thing, including bachelor villages that's growing. What is life like in a bachelor village?
Well, I think that China has seen increasing crime rates, and it's something that has a potential to be very, very destabilizing domestically.
And potentially destabilizing internationally in terms of here you have all these guys without families, and so off you go in some military campaign. That's
right. That would be a very easy and logical thing for the Chinese government to do in response to the situation. So
we'll go to your questions in a moment, but let me just ask one more right now. What about your own family, which I understand has grown recently?
That's right. Well, we have 2 new Chinese, I call them daughters, because really they are daughters to my husband and me, although we cannot legally adopt them. But they are the daughters of a famous dissident called Zhang Lin. And Zhang Lin is a former nuclear physicist. He gave all of that up at the time of the Tiananmen Square protests to work towards democracy. He's now a highly respected pro-democracy dissident writer. But he's one of these amazing people where he will write something exposing a scandal in the Chinese Communist Party and then go to jail for it for an extended period of time. I mean, 4 or 5 years. He's been beaten. He's been tortured. At one point, he was even in a wheelchair. Then he gets released. Then he exposes the next scandal, knowing full well that he's going to go back again. Well, one of the things that the Chinese Communist Party does is they persecute the children of dissidents. So his daughter, Annie, was 10 years old, went to school one day, was called to the principal's office, and then she was basically kidnapped by 4 unidentified men and spent the night in a detention center, and they wouldn't let her go back to school. Her father stood up for her, and then eventually he was detained. And so Women's Rights Without Frontiers, in collaboration with Women's Rights in China and Congressman Chris Smith and very brave people inside China, were able to get Annie and her sister to the United States. And now we're raising them in our family. They call my husband Shushu and me Ai, that's uncle and auntie. Okay. Uh-huh. But because they have 2 living parents in China, but for us they are our daughters. And
these aren't little girls, right? These are 10 and 19?
Yes, a daughter, and she just turned 11, so it's 11 and 19. And so we've gone from empty nesters, our own son left for college 6 years ago, to having a 10-year-old and a 19-year-old. So We've got a full house now.
All right, congratulations.
Thank you.
Questions from y'all? We have microphones over here and there.
Thank you so much for coming. As far as I know, the church in China is growing very rapidly. Do you know of any grassroots efforts of the church to protect these women or to help, or are they just too oppressed by the government still?
I am not aware of a grassroots effort to protect, like an organized grassroots effort to protect women who are fleeing forced abortion. because I think that what happens with a lot of these women is that they go to relatives, okay, and have their babies. And then when they come back with their babies, they have to pay a heavy fine unless they hide the baby. But at least the baby is alive. And that reminds me of our own efforts in China, which I wanted to mention to you, which is we have something called the Save a Girl campaign, where we have a network on the ground in China which is able to identify women who are pregnant with girls and who are planning to abort them, or who have had a baby girl and are getting pressured to abandon them. And we will go to these women and say, please don't abort, please don't abandon your baby just because she's a girl. She's a precious daughter, and we will give you support for a year to help you raise this baby girl. And the response has been quite overwhelming, positive response. So we are saving lives in China. And we did support a woman who was fleeing from forced abortion, but again, it was not like an organized effort from a church. She was just going from village to village to village, trying to stay one step ahead of the family planning police. We were getting money to her every month so she could just live. And then she gave birth to a beautiful baby boy, so we're very happy about that.
How do you get money to them? Just what are they?
Now. I can't keep saying that.
Okay. All right. Okay.
I mean, I'll tell you later, but I don't want this in the interview.
Okay. Fair enough.
This whole thing is very underground. We're trying to fly under the radar screen, but we do it. We hand them the equivalent of $20 is 120 yuan. We have a field worker that hands it to them every month, and then they have to sign a form saying that they received the money, so that we have, documentation that they actually received the money. We also have, well, I'm not going to go into all the documentation.
Okay. Other questions? Well, then I have more. As you look back, and you look back at these very sad things that happened, including, the 2 miscarriages and your illness and so forth. Do you have a different perspective on those right now than you had as you were going through all this?
Well, to me, my illness was almost like a road to Damascus experience, like being knocked off my horse. I was hit really hard by that illness, not only physically but also emotionally, because I was disabled. I'd gone from being this, sort of driven person that was the master of my own fate and all that, very self-reliant, to someone who was completely helpless and not knowing. My husband was very worried that I was going to die, and that is what I feel like God had to do to me, because I'm so stubborn. If that had not happened to me, probably I'd be a partner in a law firm right now and just continuing on that path. I was perfectly happy doing that. And this is what he had to do to shift me from this path that I had of wanting to be a successful lawyer, and all that brings, the beautiful home, the car, the expensive vacations. And something that the Lord, I feel, showed me during that time when I was so sick, I got this huge hunger for his word. And for the first time in my life, I read the Bible cover to cover. And then I read it over and over and over again, different translations, different sets of notes. And something that I feel that was impressed on my heart through all that reading, where I feel like God was re-hardwiring my mind, was that I had thought that I was a really exemplary Christian. I'd gone to seminary myself. I had pastored my own church. I was married to a pastor. I was not committing adultery. I was not murdering anybody. I was not stealing. I was not lying. I was representing Chinese refugees on the side. So I thought that I was just an exemplary Christian. And what I saw in reading the Bible over and over again was that almost my entire life was based on a violation of the first commandment. I am the Lord your God, and you shall not have any other gods before me. Obviously, I was not worshiping, statues of Baal and Molech in my living room, right? But what I came to understand is that anything that you put in front of God is an idol. So what was that with the 10 days of not coming home from work? I stopped going to church. I was working on Sundays, and I realized that I was idolizing money, power, prestige, my boss, my house, my car, all of that. And it was interesting because everything that I was idolizing, God took away from me during that time. All of it. And I was left with what? Just with just what he wanted me to have, which was a complete dependence on him. And once I had given up any kind of self-dependence and depended on him alone, that's when he was able to use me. And that's what it took for him. It took 5 years of being disabled and just being with him in completely dark. I mean, I was not on the internet. I had no presence in the world to make me a usable instrument for him.
Yeah. So you don't have expensive vacations anymore. But
No.
you do a lot of traveling.
Well, yeah, I mean, we go camping in Yosemite, which is great, okay? That's fun. We do not, we're not going to the Galapagos Island, cruises and cruising, Greece. And I'm not even going to go into all the vacations that we took when I was an attorney. We did lots of stuff that was very expensive, and we don't do any of that stuff now. But my life is much richer. I have 2 Chinese girls that I love that are in my home, that I'm trying to raise up in the Lord. I mean, they come from a very unchurched background. And I get to be with you, and I get to wake up every morning knowing that we're saving lives in China. So my life is much richer now. I would not trade it for anything.
So let me ask this: you grew up in a Christian home, but never read the Bible.
No.
And you were going to church as a child and everything, but none of that. You really did not get. This was a Christian home, but it really wasn't any kind of a Christian education that you were getting. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I just think that I think a lot of people in their teens have an issue with hypocrisy, and that was my big issue. So I felt that the church was hypocritical, that what I heard in church was not being practiced by the church, and so that was why I just threw the baby out with the bathwater. And instead of saying, okay, God exists, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to dedicate myself to his body, the church, and do what I can to help the church become the true body of Christ. I mean, I didn't have the wherewithal to even think those thoughts when I was 16. I just said, this must not, you are not living what you're speaking, and therefore what you're saying must not be true, Yeah.
And so your 10-year-old and your 19-year-old, are they learning about Christianity? How is that happening?
Well, every night, okay, first of all, when the 10-year-old got here, within the first week or so, we immediately got her a Chinese English Bible. She spoke no English. So this is a Chinese English children's Bible. So every night she read a chapter of that. Okay, so she got the overview of sort of the whole of salvation history through this children's Bible. And now she can read English, and her sister is here. Her sister just joined us. She went to live in New York for a few months, and then she joined us on December 8th. So her sister is here. So now we've got them Chinese, English, New Testaments that were given as a gift, and we're going through the Gospel of John. So every night we read about half a chapter of the Gospel of John. Annie reads it in Chinese because she needs to keep her Chinese, and then Lily reads it in English, and then we discuss it. So they have a Bible study at the dinner table every night. Yeah. And then they also go to church on Sundays. They spend basically the entire day Sunday in church activities.
Good. Questions now?
I was just curious, during that 5-year season when you were ill, and you were reading the Bible, and God pointed out the idolatry, but were there moments that you got revelation about what was happening to you at that time, or was it after you came out of that season? And if so, were there verses that spoke to you about where you were at in the midst of all that?
Well, in terms of revelation about God's direction in my life, this whole thing about writing a screenplay was something that was completely out of left field. And then, so that was a revelation. And then I saw, you can almost tell in retrospect if something really was the will of God by whether it takes off. And the fact that it won all these awards and actually got development funding, which is really hard to get, indicated to me that, yes, this was God's will. But then I also believe that it was God's will to start this human rights organization because it's raised the visibility of the issue from nothing to the extent in 2008, one of the elite Chinese human rights experts in the world was telling me that this is not happening anymore, Now no one denies it. No one denies it. But one of the verses, and I wish that I had my Bible with me, but there's one verse out of Proverbs. I think it's in Proverbs 24 that says, "Rescue those that are being led away to death. Speak for the voiceless. If you say, we knew about these, we did not know about these things, does not he who weighs the heart perceive it? Is not he who is the judge of your life know it? Will he not reward each person according to what he has done?" So I felt very strongly that because I knew what was going on, I had to do something about it, or there would be judgment on me. And now that you know what's going on, you have to do something about it. I mean, knowledge is responsibility.
Okay. Let's show that other video right now.
Today, India and China eliminate more girls than the number of girls born in America every year.
The definition of genocide is a systematic and methodical extermination of a certain group. And the gendercide is that systematic and methodical extermination of a gender group.
Why are Indian households secretly and brutally eliminating daughters from their family system?
They just wet the cloth and they fold it like this and they put it on the face so the child can't breathe. Immediately the child will die.
But what this is an entire system, a social machinery that says we don't want females.
But the real problem started after I became pregnant. They started asking me for a sex determination. They wanted to know if the children are girls or boys. They started torturing me to get an abortion done. What should I do to save my daughters?
कि उसके सिर हिला के देखा तो वो तो यहाँ पे गले पे पूरा निशान पड़ा हुआ है। निशान पड़ने के बाद तब हमें फिर रोना पीटना, हमारे तो होश ही उड़ गए थे लड़की को देख के कि इसने मार कैसे दी।
如果按计划生育生的话，我就只能生2个。哎呀，反正在村子里都有专人搞这些工作的嘛，就被他们知道我们在那里。
மனசுல அதை வச்சிருக்க கூடாது. பையனா இருந்தா வச்சுக்கலாம், பெண்ணா இருந்தா ஒழிச்சு பண்ணலாம். அப்படி இப்படி பிடிச்சா தேடி போச்சு. பிறந்த உடனே நானே பாசிப்படுவேன். மறுபடி பையனே இல்லை அப்படின்னு 8 குழந்தைங்களாட்டம் கொண்டு விட்டோம்.
Question?
You said if we know, then we're responsible. Mm-hmm. So what action steps should we take?
Well, thank you for asking. There's many things that people can do. We have first thing you can do is go onto my website and watch. You can view the first video that we showed, Stop Forced Abortion, and send it to your friends. Help me get the word out. You can sign a petition against forced abortion. You can support a girl through the Save a Girl campaign. You can show the It's a Girl film on campus. and and go from there. Just raise awareness of it. There are many things, and many levels of support.
Now we see the problem in India. Now that's not a governmental requirement, forced abortion, but there are enormous social pressures, economic pressures.
Right. In India, there's a different situation, which is that in India they have something called the dowry system. And so what dowry means is that when a couple marries, the parents of the girl child have to give a lot of money to the parents of the boy child. So when you're pregnant, you know that if it's a girl, 20 years from now, you're going to be out a lot of money. And if it's a boy, 20 years from now, you're going to have a lot of income. And so people just terminate the girl children. So the gender ratio in India, I've read, is approximately 112 boys born for every 100 girls born. And in China, it's more like 119 boys born for every 100 girls born. So that the coercive low birth limit in China is actually a stronger driving force towards gendercide than even the dowry system in India. And something I learned through working on this film with It's a Girl, just collaborating with them, is that in India, even though this is not government-imposed forced abortion, it is nevertheless forced abortion, like privately imposed forced abortion. So you saw the woman there that said they were trying to force me to have an ultrasound. They wanted to know if the children were girls or boys. All right. When you watch the film, you'll see her whole story, which is that they found out that she was carrying girls, and they tried, her husband and her mother-in-law tried to get her to abort those girls, to the extent of throwing her down the stairs to try to get her to miscarry, etc. So that there is a very strong correlation between forced abortion and gendercide, that these women are not generally just wanting to abort or abandon their baby girls. They are under very, very intense pressure, up to even death. I mean, where it says we couldn't, the two parents, they said we couldn't believe he would just kill her. That was a man who had strangled their daughter, his wife, because she gave birth to a girl. And in India, these are called dowry deaths, and they're normally not prosecuted. That man was prosecuted, and as I recall, he only spent about 2 weeks in jail for murdering his wife. So these gendercide is done under heavy coercion in India.
So we actually see a spectrum. I mean, there's the forced abortion, governmentally forced in China. There's forced in India in some ways by private forces, by social forces. In the United States, in some sectors, again, it's not governmentally forced, but there are enormous social pressures to abort. Does any of your analysis and coverage and exposure of what's going on in China and India, does any of that transfer to the United States as far as getting people who are on the pro-abort side to start thinking about life?
Well, I do think that the issue of forced abortion and gendercide are both getting people in the United States to think more about the abortion issue. Now, there's forced abortion in the United States, okay? Lots of times, it's one of the main ways that forced abortion happens is when parents have a teenage daughter who gets pregnant, okay? There are times when the parents will just put their feet down and tell her she has to have an abortion. That is illegal. That it is illegal for parents to force their daughter to have an abortion. And then there are times when a woman gets pregnant and her boyfriend is basically forcing her, or et cetera, et cetera. So, so that does happen in the United States. And another way that forced abortion happens in the United States, and this was exposed by Lila Rose with her live action videos, is that women are trafficked into the United States. And these trafficked women, some of them are underage, and they are forced to have sex as prostitutes, and then when they get pregnant, they are forced to have abortions too. So there's forced abortion in the United States.
Yeah. And in talking with those groups, I mean, as we saw in these films, I mean, you do talk about babies, not fetuses and so forth. So I appreciate you doing that, and I hope that gets people thinking at least. We need to cut this off right now, but quick preview of coming attractions. Susan, do you have? No, that didn't work. Tomorrow and Wednesday, we have two well-known evangelists and pastors, Louis Palau tomorrow, along with two of his sons, and David Jeremiah on Wednesday. Thursday, this is 2014, 100 years ago, June 28th, 1914, the terrible Great War began that led the way into a pretty hard century, the 20th century. We'll be hearing from the leaders of the Adriatic Institute in Public Policy about the Balkans and what's going on there right now, a very interesting and little-known area of the world for many of us in the United States. And then on Friday, we'll have Cynthia Wells, who is pioneering a new type of pregnancy resource center in Houston with the idea of saving many babies and putting Planned Parenthood out of business. So I hope you'll come for some of those. Right now, please join me in thanking Reggie and in praying for her work, praying for the women in China and India and the United States. Thank you, Reggie.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.